Even if this is your first episode of the Pax Romana podcast, you probably know that the Roman Empire stretched across multiple continents. It was ruled by emperors who were autocrats that wielded immense power. But controlling such a large empire wasn't easy. Emperors relied on armies and governors, complex network of roads, shipping lanes, messengers, and beneath this system, there was a group of soldiers, specialized soldiers, tasked with more than just delivering supplies or relaying messages. History suggests that these soldiers gathered intelligence, enforced the orders of the emperors, and even silenced threats. Their story reveals how emperors maintained their grip on power across such a vast empire. Today we answer a listener question: did Roman emperors employ spies? The answer on today's episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Question and Answers, Episode 5, Did Roman Emperors Employ Spies? We're going to get right into it today because there is a lot of material here. I want to begin with the origins of a group that was absolutely central to the question of spies in the Roman Empire. This group was called the frumentarii, and their story might begin as early as the late 1st century under the Emperor Domitian. If you remember from earlier episodes in the podcast, Domitian ruled from AD 81 to 96, the 1st century AD. At this point, Rome's empire had grown large. Rome's military probably numbered something like 300,000 men or more, and there was a tremendous need to feed all of these soldiers. And it may have been Domitian who created a specialized type of soldier called a frumentarius, which comes from the Latin word frumentum, Latin for grain. And a frumentus handled the purchase and distribution of grain for Rome's legions. These men were logistical. They weren't necessarily secret agents or spies, but Domitian saw some potential in using these men beyond their original remit. So he turned these guys into something more, a kind of intelligent service. And Domitian didn't have to create all aspects of this intelligence agency from scratch. The Roman Empire already had a kind of postal system. It was called the cursus publicus, roads linking Rome to provincial capitals, routes that couriers could use to carry messages, stopping at local waypoints or inns. This postal network was already in existence. Governors helped maintain the network in their province, and Domitian, who was, if you'll remember from episode 27, an especially paranoid and suspicious emperor. And it kind of makes sense that he would be the one to put two and two together. Hey, we have a courier network already in existence. I also have these guys that know the grain supply and they have military training. Why not use them to gather information? Probably by the end of Domitian's reign, the frumentarii were given their own camp inside the city of Rome. Their barracks could house about 400 men, roughly a dozen men from each Roman legion. But these men weren't entirely a distinct unit. At least on paper, each of the frumentarii were still connected to their legion. In practice, however, they answered to a special commander who was probably a senior centurion in rank, and he reported directly to the emperor. He did not go to any officers above him in the legions. Now, you can read about the roles of the frumentarii in a few great books. First, I recommend Intelligence Activities in Ancient Rome by Rosemary Sheldon, a woman I have the pleasure of meeting when I used to work at Washington and Lee University. She was just across the campus at Virginia Military Institute, and I still have a bunch of her books that I inherited from her in my office to this day. Her book on Roman intelligence is great. I also think Christopher Furman's book, Policing the Roman Empire, is also a great place to read more about frumentarii. Both of those authors speak to the early duties of this new unit as being focused on communication. They carried orders and reports between Rome and the provinces. With such a large empire, emperors needed fast, reliable messaging in order to control the whole thing and ensure that supplies reached the legions. But of course, as Domitian and other emperors noticed, the fact that you had men crisscrossing the entire empire, going along roads, staying in inns, put them in a unique position. They saw everything. Troop movements, they listened to local grumbling, they knew the habits of different governors, they could listen and observe and then report back to the emperor what they saw. And over time, emperors began to lean on frumentarii for more than just sending and receiving letters. You might remember just a few episodes ago when I talked about Macrinus, the emperor who was in charge for just about a year and a half. That was episode 68 in the early 3rd century. When Macrinus lost his battle for control of the Roman Empire and he fled back towards Rome, he actually disguised himself as a frumentarius. He dressed in a soldier's uniform, and he used the cursus publicus, the courier system, to slip away and then requisition horses along his route and supplies without being bothered. Now, eventually, as I mentioned in that podcast episode, he was caught and he was killed. The fact that he used the frumentarius network shows just how trusted and mobile those soldiers were. Their access was a tool that emperors could exploit to gather intelligence. Now, I mentioned earlier that Domitian is probably the one that puts all of this together, but a spy network is by nature secretive, and the evidence for the frumentarii is not strong, especially when we're thinking about their origins. We don't have firm evidence until the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. And Hadrian ruled from AD 117 to 138. He was, as we saw in the episodes on Hadrian, a hands-on micromanager of a ruler. He traveled the empire, taking numerous tours, inspecting the soldiers. However, Hadrian couldn't be everywhere at once, and so he turned to frumentarii to watch his inner circle. There is an account in a fairly unreliable source, the Augustan History, which may or may not be true, but the fact that the author of the source thinks it plausible suggests that even if the details of the story aren't true, its essence may be emblematic of espionage in the Roman Empire. In the story, a frumentarius stationed in Rome under Hadrian was enjoying life in the city. He was taking baths, engaging in leisure activities, while his wife wrote him angry letters about his behavior. Some things are true in ancient times as well as modern times. Hadrian's agents evidently intercepted those letters. Eventually, the soldier asked Hadrian for leave, and the emperor, having this intelligence, confronted him with it directly, telling the soldier he'd been far too fond of his own pleasures. The man asked if Hadrian had been contacted by his angry wife, and Hadrian said, "No, your wife didn't have to tell me. I had spies who dug up the dirt on you." So in the episode, regardless of its veracity, we see that spies weren't merely used for purposes of national security. They engaged in personal surveillance. Frumentarii could snoop on anyone, friends of the emperor, fellow soldiers, even members of the emperor's court. Their base was in Rome. It was near the Colosseum, keeping them close to power. And they always remained a very small group, maybe 200 in Rome and another 200 scattered about in the provinces. By the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, frumentarii were fully engaged in espionage, but also tasks like policing, even assassinations, and they gradually became a group to be feared across the entire empire. By the end of the Pax Romana in the late 2nd century AD, governors legitimately expected that maybe one of the people nearby them might in secret be a frumentarius. The Augustan History, again, for example, speaks of the Emperor Gallienus, who ruled in the middle of the 3rd century, ordering his frumentarii to report what his governors and officials said about him, paying special attention to criticism. But in addition to watching officials, frumentarii gathered intelligence on broader social unrest. While they were passing messages back and forth across the empire, they eavesdropped on soldiers, on locals, on tax collectors, and their reports allowed the emperor to shape his decisions and his policies. Were the soldiers in one particular area restless? Was a governor plotting? The emperor needed to know these things, and the frumentarii delivered that intelligence. Well, I also mentioned assassination. Emperors didn't just want information, they sometimes needed to act. Evidently, Septimius Severus, as well as his son Caracalla, used frumentarii often as assassins, and he promoted them, putting them in high positions, including as prefect of the Praetorian Guards. Now, one frumentarius couldn't do a lot of policing on his own, but it sounds like they could requisition local soldiers. In Rome, they could take command, for example, of the vigiles, the urban police, and order them on various policing and peacekeeping tasks in the city. They may have even been involved in the persecution of Christians. Supposedly under Trajan Decius, who, if you remember from episode 74, issued an edict requiring every single individual in the Roman Empire to sacrifice to the gods. Well, evidently Decius used a frumentarius to capture Dionysius, the bishop of Alexandria in Egypt. You have to remember that even if an emperor wanted an audience with an individual for benign purposes, you couldn't just call them up on the phone. Somebody had to go find them. And frumentarii were experts in locating people the emperors wanted found, for good or for ill. As the empire found itself under increasing economic strain in the 3rd century, the role of frumentarii changed yet again. The Roman currency had become debased, people were using it far less because it wasn't valuable, and as a result, the Roman tax system shifted towards taxes in goods rather than taxes in cash. Frumentarii were used to collect these in-kind taxes. But these were men who were used to getting their way, to pushing people around, even killing people. And so their approach to collecting in-kind taxes was one of bullying and even brutality. Some sources suggest that frumentarii were not always acting on orders that they had received, but were just choosing to arbitrarily arrest people and seize their property. The 4th century historian Aurelius Victor called the frumentarii a plague. These were no longer just spies acting in the interests of the empire. They were local brutes that ransacked homes, levied arbitrary fines, and took bribes. People in the empire were already suffering during a time of civil war and economic insecurity, and now their officials were abusing them. Finally, around AD 300, the Emperor Diocletian, who we will meet when we resume our narrative, decided to act. By imperial decree, he disbanded the frumentarii. He didn't stop using intelligence, but he did clean the slate, ditching the frumentarii for a new spy agency, specially dedicated, more centralized, and in theory, more accountable to the emperor. So Roman emperors did employ spies. Frumentarii were taxmen, they were enforcers, they could be corrupt, and as we see under Diocletian, they could ultimately be abolished when their corruption became unbearable. Intelligence was obviously crucial to Roman emperors, no matter who did that work. It's a shame we don't know more about them, but because they operated in the shadows, they leave very few traces of their presence behind. And so when you're listening to episodes of this podcast, and I mention that an emperor had thus and such person assassinated, or an emperor himself was assassinated, or that some emperor sent a letter to somebody else, it may have been the case that a frumentarius was the person that made that happen. And we know just enough about them to know that they were there, but in many ways, these spies in the Roman Empire are still a mystery.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.